So together with the Yale-NUS Farming Collective, we put together these panels because we really felt there were these silos and both imagined and real boundaries around the conversations of food security, food sustainability, and food sovereignty in Singapore. We wanted to bring together policymakers, academics, chefs, farmers, food writers to all come together and kind of really have a roundtable discussion around these topics. If you've joined us for the last two panels, we had quite exciting sessions exploring, where do you find that? Where does culture and tradition sit amongst all of this? Can we grow moringa indoors? Can we still cook our traditional heritage dishes? What is Singapore's future food landscape? And I think what we came away with in those sessions was that kind of having a healthy, growing community, just starting to grow, maybe starting to cook, having good soil, all kind of is a symbol of a larger thriving community and nation. So today's panelists are going to bring us to this future with sharing their expertise, their experience, and their envisioning of this landscape. We have Dr. Paul Teng. He is an agricultural scientist who has worked and taught all over the world. He's a renowned expert in plant pathology, and he's also very active in the field of food security and agri-tech. Bjorn of Edible Garden City is biodynamic farming trained, but he has also been integral in making urban farming very cool and sexy for a whole new generation of people. So he is all about green space making in very central parts of urbanized Singapore and finding that balance between high-tech and indigenous plants. We have Evelyn of Green Circle Eco Farm. She's been running that farm for 21 years. She's a qualified chemist, educator, and conservationist who believes very much in how biodynamic farming, sustainable practices can also result in productivity, highly nutritious foods that resonate and are relatable for a community. We also have Farida, who's Deputy Director of Agri-Tech at Enterprise Singapore. They are really driving both the agriculture and aquaculture industry in Singapore. So there's a lot of innovation-based approaches, support and grants for farmers and agri-tech entrepreneurs. And Farida will be sharing very much what the Enterprise Singapore's approach is to making this landscape come true. Our moderator for today is Ben. He's a Yale-NUS alumni. At the moment, which is a VC accelerator specializing in aquaculture investment. So I'm going to pass it over to Ben, and he's going to bring us.
Hi, good evening, everyone. All 58 of you joining us tonight. A very good Saturday evening to everyone with that features a range of different panelists. I think it's not always that we get farmers, academics, and also policymakers. Of course, in all their roles, they wear different hats. Paul is also an advisor to agri-food startup. Today, we're really here to discuss food security. And this is a pertinent question. I think most people here today would have heard of 30 by 30, which is producing 30% of Singapore's local nutritional needs by 2030. So for this to safe and nutritious food, of course, this happens at different levels. There's a national level, there's a household and community level. But by access, we mean physical access. They're able to go to a supermarket nearby, readily find healthy food for them. Economic access, they're able to afford it. And maybe also cultural access, where they know what to do with different varieties of foods in different cuisines. But really, to kick off this conversation, my first question is, who is food security for? Now, this is a little vague. It's about the affordability of food produce, right? Because in Singapore, we all know the story, land is expensive, labor, technology, and we're making all these high-tech farms, agri-tech farms, right? So how does affordability of local produce impact its effectiveness in alleviating food insecurity in Singapore? And I'd like to direct this question first to Bjorn.
Thank you. Oh, it's a surprise. I didn't know I was going first. Yeah, so I guess food security, I feel it's for everyone. But we tend to rely a lot on, put responsibility to the government to drive and institutions to drive food security. And because the mechanism has been so effective, that sometimes we tend to be a bit complacent, right, of, food being served and always abundant in the food court. So much so that, so effective that we waste 700,000 tons per annum or even more, right? So, alternative food movements has always been driven by ineffective government policies, right? So you've seen then community really step up to really take charge and drive change in the space. That really, the food sovereignty movement has been largely driven by that because of, corporate oversight of the agri system and, small scale farmers stepping up to take control. Really relating to food injustice and justice systems around that. But the thing is, if you look at Cuba in the 60s, through the oil embargo, you see that the people actually took charge and they went out, they started to grow food, they dug up car parks, they had to do it for survival. And to counter all these geopolitical shifts. But today, that concept is really known as agrarian urbanism, right? Where how we take farming and sort of putting that into our urban planning considerations. And so, it's really a whole society effort, I feel, for food growing, and food security should be for everyone and not just government institutions pushing for it.
Thanks, Bjorn. At this point, Farida, maybe I could have some of your thoughts as well, because I do know that local produce often has to compete in terms of price competitiveness with the import. So wondering what are any of Enterprise Singapore's policies to help support local food companies?
Thanks so much, Ben. Actually, first and foremost, not many people. I like that we make you define what food security actually means from the start of the conversation, which is important because by any standards, actually, if you had to differentiate food security, food insecurity, and food resilience, Singapore is actually extremely food secure by global standards. And what that means is that we have BAU access to affordable, varied foodstuff, as well as very high quality, very due to the strong and high standards of our food. So in that sense, I think one can say that we are food secure. Are we then food resilient? Right, and that's where that conversation around local production and sort of our three-pronged strategies to enable us to build more resilience in our food supply chain comes through, which we'll unpack a little bit later. Maybe just again take a step back to introduce Enterprise Singapore, because I'm not too sure how many of you are familiar what it is that we do. So we are actually a government agency under the Ministry of Trade and Industry, MTI. Broadly, our mandate is to grow strong local enterprises. Specifically, my role as Nithiya had mentioned earlier on, I have the extreme pleasure of working with agri-tech enterprises, farmers, inputs players, as well as system providers, startups, as well as SMEs and fairly large local enterprises. And that's my day job, right? And they actually pay me to do this. So for us, it's really about developing enterprises. Some of our work involves inputs to policy making, right? So there is a distinction, and you guys as undergraduates at Yale and US, you would understand that, right? Moving forward, sort of the policy making levers, of course, rest in certain government institutions. Dominantly in Singapore's context, that would be in the Ministry of Sustainability and Environment. But of course, agri-food tech is such a huge, imperative for us that you have all these different agencies, ESG being one of them, that actually supports that, right? So that's just to clarify what it is that we do, and why I guess they decided to extend this invitation for me to be part of the panel. And finally, to address, I think Ben's point is really what levers, right, do we have? And you brought up this issue of the price, or not reaching price parity of local produce and what we term as imports, or in particular, imports from our neighboring countries. That's, I think, something that consumers recognize. It's certainly something that the government recognize, and it's certainly something that businesses recognize. And we've seen that how they respond to that is to look at perhaps premium produce that they could be growing. So they wouldn't be looking at competing in the Asian green space, in which our neighbors are able to actually offer a much lower rate. Now, does that actually enable us to be more food secure or otherwise? I think that's another discussion that we can actually probably unpack a little bit later. Yeah.
Thank you, Farida, and thanks so much for the distinction between food security versus food resilience, and maybe we'll touch a bit more on that later. But Paul, wondering if you have any thoughts on this question on affordability. Sorry, Paul, you're muted. Sorry, Paul, you're muted.
Here we go. Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah. Well, obviously, affordability is a very important component of food security. But it's senseless to have food around if you can't buy it. Okay? And I'd like to kind of perhaps go back to what you kind of introduced, what food security is. You left out a couple of key words. Okay? Because if you go back to the Food and Agriculture Organization's definition, it actually starts by saying that all people, food security only happens when all people at all times, right, have access to safe and nutritious food. And the nutrition part is very key. Okay? So in the context of affordability, anytime, you have any factor that disrupts the supply chain, inevitably prices go up. And that affects the affordability of food, especially to poorer households. Now, the other interesting fact to note is that, generally, Singapore households can afford to buy food. Okay? And the figures I've seen, are that Singapore households, on the average, only spend about 10% of the income on food, on the average. Okay? So they're poorer households who have to spend a lot more. And this contrasts very sharply in our neighboring countries like Indonesia and Philippines, where sometimes half the income has to be spent on food. So any very little rise in prices dramatically affects the affordability of food itself. Yeah. Now, in the context of Singapore, though, local produce we know is more expensive. Okay? Now, I guess we'll get into this later. What can you do to incentivize people to pay that premium? That's a question that I think it's a tough question to answer, because all our surveys have shown in Singapore that Singapore consumers are very price sensitive, especially the heartlanders, the majority of people. We always have the kind of, the premium customers who buy organic food, kale, and so on, where it doesn't make much difference to them in terms of affordability. But the general public, I would say the average person, is very price sensitive itself. So I'll stop there, man. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. And also for expanding the definition to FAO's one. Definitely hear your point on the price sensitivity of heartlanders. I work in aquaculture, and I'm always looking at the different prices that local farms produce. And I always use my mother as a litmus test, and because she always buys all the fish. And then I say like, would you buy this? Then I say, oh, would you buy this? Then she shakes her head. And I was like, okay. Then it's a moving index that I have at home. The mother index. But I want to shift the conversation now to Evelyn from Green Circle Eco Farm. Evelyn, you're a farmer, you have to sell the produce, and just wondering, what are your thoughts on affordability?
Oh, okay. As Paul says, that the majority of Singaporeans, those in the medium income and all that, you only sort of spend about 10%. So the thing is, I'm always telling people, sometimes I come across this situation where a person comes in with a Mercedes car and then they start bargaining with me. Whereas a person who comes along in a motorcycle, he just buy, without, just accepting the price. So sometimes when people sort of said, that, are so expensive, I say, hey, I'm subsidizing you, actually, in my selling the food to you. Yeah. So it's a question of attitude and whether they are eating, not just for health, but for the environmental cost also, that people have to be educated into knowing, the type of food that they're consuming and its impact on the environment. So when it comes to affordability, I, as a farmer, as I've said often, that, if you cannot afford it and you really want to eat it, I can just give it to you for free, or you can come and help me. I can give you a piece of land and you can help to farm.
Thanks for sharing that, Evelyn. Definitely, you have a very big heart, and this sort of progressive pricing is maybe something that's harder to achieve at maybe the retailer level or the national level. Maybe I want to double click on what Paul mentioned in terms of 10% of household income is spent on food, because we do know rising inequality is a thing in Singapore. Wondering in different demographics from age to income, are there how much more are certain socioeconomic groups in Singapore paying for certain basic food items, if this information is available? If not, maybe share a bit on ongoing studies or yeah.
Maybe I can chime in here. I believe that there was a study done by SMU not too long ago on food poverty in Singapore, and they I think it was a survey done. I think more so it's not so much that the accessibility is not there. It's choices, right? Food choices. I think low income families tend to choose high carbohydrate, processed food instead of fresh food, and because of whether it's the parents are not there and the kids then have access to, so it's more a societal issue than more accessibility, because if you can buy fresh vegetable at a very affordable price today in Singapore, there's no question why they would choose that over a packet of instant noodles, for example. So that's a study by SMU. I think it's good to check that out. I can't really remember the exact details.
Thanks, Bjorn. And I think it was just shared by the team in the chat for all of our listeners here today. Wondering, Paul, if you have anything to add. If not, we can move on also to the next question.
Sorry, could you repeat your question, Ben? Because I didn't quite catch it.
Right. In the 10% that was found of that local Singaporean households spend on local food produce, how much or is there any information for different socioeconomic groups? And if so, how much more are the lower income groups paying for certain food items, for example?
There's very little information available in Singapore that can be cited, unfortunately. Studies have been done, but in other countries, a lot of this data is available. The figure I quoted, in fact, was from an international organization called GAIN, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. Okay? And they cite these figures. Now, we also know that there's been press releases and studies done in Singapore to show that there's at least 100,000 families who regularly fall below the food insecurity line. And these are the ones, especially during COVID times, that fortunately are catered to by voluntary welfare organizations. So we still have a number of caring people here in Singapore that are very concerned. I mean, their heart is as good as Evelyn's, so to speak, because they collect it and they give it away, right? But in the end, I think we need to address the average person, the average family, the masses. And we really can't afford to have prices go up. Now, I wrote a recent article on this. If you look at it, the global food price index has been going up for the last 6 months, and it's not going to stop anytime soon. Okay, so that's really worrisome, yeah, even for the middle class families, because it's not just not being able to buy food, but as I think Sean says, one of the not sure, I mean, beyond says one of the first symptoms of affordability is when people start substituting food, the nutritious ones to the non-nutritious ones, so they can buy more. And this has been well studied, quite frankly, you know. And on that note, you know, one of the things I preach to Evelyn, you know, is that eating leafy vegetable greens are not sufficient. You can have a rainbow diet of vegetables, different colors and so on. And this is where I think beyond your work, you know, on indigenous vegetables is so important. If we could have people eating a bigger variety of multicolored vegetables, if they're going to avoid that third pillar of malnutrition, which is insufficient minerals and vitamins and so on. Thank you. That will be my short response. Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. Really appreciate the insight. And what I'm really hearing is that maybe Singaporeans, and especially those that can afford to, should change their expectations on how much they should be paying for food, especially for locally produced food, which contributes so much to our local food security. In these 2 weeks with the shutting down of Jurong Fishery Port, the local supply chains have had to pivot so much. Bigger local farms in terms of aquaculture, because I'm more familiar with this, have had to increase their stock, and there's an entire supply chain behind this. So I think moving on to the next thing, the next question really is, how do we best achieve food security and food resilience in Singapore, as Farida was mentioning before? What exactly should we be aiming for within the next 30 years and beyond? Evelyn, maybe your thoughts on this?
We should actually focus and concentrate, you know, on growing perennial greens and perennial herbs. In Singapore, whatever arable land, most of those who are in commercial farming, they are only growing greens because the turnover is so much faster in terms of money-wise and product-wise. So, so if you were thinking of food security, that is the approach, because you know, seeds, as I was saying, you cannot grow Chinese greens so that you can seed them. Yeah, I've got this new farmer that I've just employed, and his boss in New Zealand was actually growing all these Chinese greens for seeds to export. I don't know of, and they export to Thailand, one of the bigger market. And you know, Thailand, you've got Chiang Mai, which is quite cool. And most of these Chinese greens actually thrive on cooler climes. But again, of course, certain times of the year you cannot get, you have to eat in season. But the thing is, the seed is so important. And I've seen over the years, say from 4 or 5 years ago, the seed was only about, now it's risen to almost 4 or 5 times from 5 or 6 years ago. Yeah. So the supplier that I get is now selling the seeds in smaller and smaller packets. So that's quite alarming, very much alarming, actually. As Bjorn was saying, you know, yesterday, that yeah, seed availability is is something. And another thing is resilience. If you're growing all the perennial greens, then it will withstand a lot of change of weather, you know, whether it's because of climate change. And then mitigate, well, so you can mitigate weather resilience and the ability to extend drought, heavy rainfall, heat, and pest resilience also. And a food forest, I believe, is the answer to this. You know, food forest has been in practice in this part of the world. And I just remembered that my part-time accounts person and their family, actually she was raised in a farm in Neo Tiew Road, and it was mixed farming. They got about 5 acres, about the same size as my land. And they were able to support 2 families, the uncle with 4 children and wife, and she and the parents and 3 other siblings. And yet they were able to have an income that can put them comfortably through school, through education, and they live comfortably. So this type of mixed farming, or actually almost like a food forest, because yeah, they had a lot of fruits and all that. So this method, I think, I mean, with due respect, that now we are going to high tech and all that, but shouldn't we also consider that soil farming, and especially food forests, is actually a very resilient way of farming? And yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Evelyn. I'm hearing two things now. One, Paul mentioned earlier with the global food price index rising over the past 6 months, but then also the inputs for all of these, like the seeds, also rising, and it's clear they're coming in smaller packets. Wondering what you are seeing beyond as a practitioner.
I take an example during the last circuit breaker. We had problems assessing seeds from the US, where most of our seeds come from, because a lot of the then seed producing nations were also unsure of the situation, right? So they were keeping stock for their own industries first before exporting it. So that was quite a disruption for us. Even running some of our hydroponic systems, for example, getting the ingredients for the fertilizers from even Malaysia had some issues, right? So I think the pandemic and the supply chain disruption has shown how fragile those systems are. I think we really need to rethink what closed loop is, right? Today, we import 90%, we still throw away 700,000 tons. In very much sense, a lot of farms operate in a high input, high output kind of model, right? You have lots of input. Perhaps we should look at a low input, high output model. Think about the 700,000 tons of waste. How do we capture that, turn that into a resource that fed back into our food growing system in the city, and really create that resilient closed loop system, right, in Singapore itself. I think the bigger part that I always have a concern, I mean, we've been around for the last 8 to 9 years, is the people resiliency, or at least the training and education portion of resiliency. I think over the years, today we hire 40 people in our team. I think over the last 9 years, probably we train close to 100 people coming in and out. A lot of them stay for 2-3 years. It's a big cost associated with training on farm operations, on plants, on managing the farm. They leave 2 to 3 years. It's no fault. It's how it is today. But the cost then is associated and borne by enterprises like us. I think that cost and that responsibility should be shared with institutions as well. And in a way, whether it can be synergized together to really drive the industry. I think if food security and food resiliency is such an important topic, and this 30 by 30 goal, I think developing our people sector is really important as well as part of that strategy.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Bjorn. Paul, can I get your thoughts also on the supply chains? We had a quick pre-panel chat yesterday, and you're mentioning about Singapore's efforts in securing not only the food that's being produced locally, but also the supply chains.
Certainly, Ben. I think the supply chain issue is not just about food. I mean, as Bjorn has said, we depend, in fact, on external supply chains for all our inputs for farming, almost all. It's not just seed is probably one of the most important. Fertilizer, pesticides, and other kinds of chemicals. In fact, I was a fish farmer before too, Ben. I'm a bankrupt fish farmer because I couldn't sell my fish, at the price I can recover my cost. Okay? But one of the major costs is the cost of input, animal feed, cargill, the CP that I have to input. So unless we do something about our input situation, we're forever going to be at the mercy of supply chains. Because in any crisis, and we're going to see many more of these crises coming on, in the future, unless you've got some internal capability to produce even partially your inputs, you're in big trouble. Now, I say this from experience, for those of you who remember the Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, the most severe typhoon that hit the Philippines several years ago, I was asked to advise, and they were not short of rice. They were short of rice seeds for the next season. And that taught them a big lesson. Okay, so they've now started stockpiling seeds, rice seeds. Now, you might well ask the same question, because I talk to lots of farmers here too, should we be stockpiling seeds in some way to anticipate future catastrophes? Yeah, I'm one of those that, I'm quite skeptical about our capacity to be truly self-sufficient in producing seeds here in Singapore. Okay. Now, we may have the capability to produce seeds, if we cater to the global market. If again, our limitations are there, and Farida and I have talked about this before, we can ask, at what stage of the seed production process do we play in Singapore, given our limited resources, and the trade-offs, yeah? So yeah, the supply chain indeed is very important. So the government, has put in some enablers. Okay? One, of course, is trying to secure the infrastructure for supply chains, ensuring that the ships, the air, cargoes come in and so on. The other is to have special agreements. They call them the kind of supply chain continuity agreements. Okay? Of course, the third then is to work through very special farms, which Singapore has an interest in. If they're sure that their surplus does come back to Singapore. But all this, are still about getting food from outside, because a big part of the resilience picture has to be some level of self-production that can protect us for a few months at least, until we recover, until we get back to a different new normal itself. Yeah. So thanks for the question. Quick question.
Thanks, Paul. And Paul mentioned about the government. So of course, we need to ask Farida now. Is it from Enterprise Singapore's point of view, in terms of the support that is offered to local agri-food companies, how much discussions are there on ensuring the resiliency of their supply chain and their continued ability to produce?
Well, that's such an important topic. If actually not for COVID, even pre-COVID, these are discussions that we've been having simply just because of resource constraints, because of climate change, etc. But I think COVID-19 has really exacerbated the need for us to make those value chains, stand essentially. So if you can think about it, and I think it's been articulated a bit, before, for Enterprise Singapore, and actually, the government in general, we're looking at two parts, right? We're trying to strengthen the resilience of that supply chain, and in that case, that food value chain. And in that food value chain, you have producers on one side, but we shouldn't forget our logistics. We shouldn't forget our processors, and we definitely didn't forget them when we realized, how we really actually over relied on them. In particular, for example, the Jurong port. Not many people realize that actually, in addition to just being that gateway for seafood to come in, it's also the largest seafood and fish processing hub that we have, right? And that then has a knock-on effect on our retailers, our distribution channels. How resilient are they, right? So I think for the government, it's about ensuring by 2030, when we say we want to be food resilient, is that food value chain resilient, right? And then we go one level down to say, are the enterprises, the key players within each of those pillars, right? Be it the retailers, in this case, could be the supermarket chains, be it the farmers themselves, both high-tech, soil-based. You have your systems guys as well. And then lastly, you've got your inputs. How resilient are each of these players within that value chain? And then that's where we take sort of a more enterprise, specific enterprise level support, right? A lot of them are looking at, so maybe just to take one example, right? So for inputs in particular, we actually have quite a number of the multinational inputs players in Singapore. But yet, why is there this notion that actually we're not quote unquote resilient on inputs? Because the manufacturing and production takes place elsewhere, right? And a lot of these companies that are here, what we've anchored here is the IP, the R&D, etc. But at the end of the day, like Paul mentioned, it has to come from external, right? So then we have to relook at some of these, some of these operations that we have, and where can we work with them, because we can't do everything ourselves. I mean, we've got your Bayers, your Syngentas, and your Cargills, and they're all here already. Then it's about pivoting that conversation to, okay, you started out with us 30 plus years ago, maybe started out as a small trading outfit, etc. How can we move you, to actually do a lot more activities here in Singapore, to enable us to be that much more resilient. So that's just taking an example for inputs. How do we build resilience for farms, actually? And I'm a big believer in that. A farm, first and foremost, with the exception of course, big kind hearts like Evelyn and a few of the other community gardens out there. A lot of farms, for them, this has to be a business, right? It has to be a sustainable business. And for them, how do you build resilience? It's actually, are you even commercially viable, right? We can't even talk about resilience if you're not, able to actually say that you'll be around 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road. So then the work that we do with them is really, okay, let's have a look at that business model, right? Maybe the tech is great, maybe the addressable market is there, but maybe there's something missing here and there, right? And ultimately, I think that's also how we would then look at building resilience for our, for our producers in terms of enterprises. Yeah.
Thank you, Farida. Wondering, Evelyn, you have any comments in terms of love the food forest concept in terms of agroforestry and the multi-cropping? Any of your thoughts in terms of commercial resiliency?
Yes, I think so. Especially, the food forest, it's actually a very efficient way of growing, yeah? Because you have 7 layers and you're making every inch of the vertical, horizontal space, the underground space and all that. It's just that and it thrives, and the food forest thrives in this wet climate. Yeah? And so it's very highly productive. But the thing is, I grow so much, and how to get it to the consumer, because the consumers, I have been so used to all these Chinese greens and all that. And so it's quite alien to them, especially when you have parents, I tell them, oh, why don't you, I don't have chai sim pai chai, can you take, Brazilian spinach? Oh, my child doesn't like it. Yeah, during the COVID earlier period, when the government had the first lockdown, everybody sort of panic and empty all the shelves in the of people. Enough Chinese greens. That time the Chinese greens were growing quite well. But, I plant them according to my number of customers, my usual number of customers. I will send it to you. I will provide you a basket, but you must accept this perennial greens. And then I have to send them videos on how to cook and all that. Take it, they don't look at the video, and then they come back to me and say that it's inedible. But, it takes, actually, I'm now experimenting. Tasty, especially the nasi ulam, yeah. And then also things like stew and all that, yeah. And, a food forest, let's look, no. But they don't plant bananas. But do you know that a banana is so productive? The stem of the banana tree, yeah, you can juice it, you can cook it, and one tree, how many kilograms, and then also the fruit and also the banana leaf, how productive can it be when you compare to, perennial greens in a way, and all these tree leaves, like moringa and all that. You use so much labor. Your input is you don't have to use so much labor. My 5-acre, 2 hectare, 22,000 square meter farm. Actually, all you need is 3 workers only. And you compare it now with urban farms, with other form of farming, I just wonder how much office staff we need, how much labor you need. It's so much easier to maintain because you save labor on planting, because you have to keep on replanting. But when it's perennials, you save labor costs on replanting most of the time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Evelyn, on this description on how space is saved, especially using perennial greens, and also talking about how so many different parts of the plants can be used. But from what you are saying, and also from the earlier panels, it sounds that Singaporeans or maybe are kind of alienated from what their heritage greens are, the nasi ulam, the local herbs that have been used for time immemorial in Singapore, all the way back centuries. And maybe there's a role for culture to play to shift how Singaporeans, especially younger generations like myself, want to approach the making of food, especially if we want to be food secure and food resilient. Beyond, I'm really keen to hear your thoughts as well on commercial resiliency and how to incorporate maybe indigenous varieties for your customers, and how to maybe also educate the consumer.
Yeah, I chime the same tune as Evelyn. Yeah, big believer in regen ag, food foresting, whether it's biodynamic agriculture approaches. Though we straddle both sides of the spectrum, right? We do have indoor farms, container farms, and also soil-based approaches, and each one serves a different purpose and a need as well. I think what we have seen, at least in the 70s in Singapore, way before I was born, there was an effort by the government to grow 55,000 fruit trees, right, all around Singapore, in a way to get people to be more in touch with their food source. That was when the dwindling number of farms were happening. But in the end, the community was meant to sort of prop this whole initiative up. But the community was not ready, and they decided there was too much work. And so they ripped up all the 55,000 fruit trees. I think there's still some around. You see those mango trees planted in mass in some estates. And these are then potentially those heritage plants and things that could get people sort of a lot more in tune with what is available, right? I think as a society, we might have already lost quite a lot of that in what we call autochthonous food practices in Singapore. We eat very much with a global palate. We eat with a mindset of our or habits of our forefathers or grandparents, right? And therefore, the huge demand of Chinese greens because of that major migration from China to Singapore. And so I think there is really, this is the time for resurgence of these kind of practices to come back to guide us on where our food future should be. And it's not something that is really just based on Southeast Asia autochthonous practices. If you look globally, this is a resurgence of a movement in Australia, in Europe, in the US. Native food knowledge is coming back, and how do we adapt that to our current agriculture system is now being debated even on the United Nations Foods System Summit that's happening now. So what we have done is we have taken a lot of these things like sayur manis, moringa. We introduced that to the chefs that we work with, for them to make it palatable, like Nithiya, make it palatable in a more sexy way, so that people can learn how to cook them, consume them, and really drive it that way. We had some progress in that, but I think a bigger push is much necessary.
Thank you for sharing, Beyond. I posted a link really quick on NParks. They have a trees.sg to locate all the different types of species of trees. I guess now maybe the most pertinent is durian season. You know, a couple of people got into trouble foraging durians. But there are many trees all over, not also in Pulau Ubin, as one was mentioning in the first webinar. But also really like your point, Beyond, that you're mentioning that now it's time for a resurgence. Pamelia mentioned in the second panel as well that maybe we can be more creative, and it's so much of the work that Nithiya has been doing as well, how to include local foods to be maybe more sexy, so that people, as a form of education perhaps, right? But definitely this idea of resilience, right? We might be food secure now, we might be resilient to a certain extent, but what would that look like in the future, right? I think it is no understatement to say that it's incredibly uncertain what the uncertainty for maybe the region is moving forward. And I'm wondering also because Beyond mentioned that in the 70s, there was a drive, right, for greater food security. I see Eliza on the call. I'm not sure if it's the Eliza that wrote this paper on case study on Singapore's smart governance of food, when maybe we can take heart that Singapore has achieved relative food sufficiency before in the past by 1975, because there was an effort in conjunction with the United Nations, UNDP, and then Primary Production Department, now known as Singapore Food Agency. And we had 80% self-sufficiency of poultry, 100% eggs, and 104% of pork. But definitely that looks very different now in Singapore's landscape because we're lacking of land, labor is expensive, and inputs are also very expensive. So with this outlook, I'd like to direct the question to Paul, right? What should we be targeting, aiming for in the next 30 years and beyond? You wrote recently or a short while ago that to meet the remaining 70% of food needs, we will still require that Singapore has to be a responsible global citizen in addressing food security elsewhere.
Sure, Ben. But before I answer that point, I want to jump in as an example of household resilience, what I myself did. You know, I grew mani chai, which is the soyo manis that Bjorn mentioned, you know, basically on my balcony, and more than enough, put in my mung beans, okay, which is really nutritious. I have Thai basil that I'm giving away now because they're so, you know, luxurious, and they keep growing and growing, and I can't eat them all. I've got my pandanas, and these are all, you know, on my balcony. The point I'm trying to make is that, you know, the kind of, you know, forest that I think Evelyn talks about, not many farm families or not many families in Singapore can indulge in that, because most of our people live in you know, condos, apartments, you know. But I want to share that it is possible to have some level of household resilience by growing potted vegetables. In fact, I've got a variety of bean that goes from seed to harvest in 4 weeks. And I have more beans I can eat during the pandemic. Okay, so these are very possible things that we can all do as households, especially for those of you, you know, participants today. You know, you don't have to have landed properly, quite frankly. Okay, you can grow stuff in your balcony, and even grow sufficient for yourself. Huh? And one of my favorite trees, in fact, is my limapurut. Okay, I mean, I keep giving away my limapurut leaves to lots of friends when they want to make certain things. You know, but back to the important question. Okay. I think that going forward, yeah, I mean, certainly, okay, part of the question is we're going to continue to have to import. We recognize that. I think one of your chat group talked about staples, you know, for staples, it doesn't make sense for us to grow rice in Singapore, although technically we can, because I've seen rice on rooftops in China, floating rice. You know, I used to work at the International Rice Research Institute as well. So technically we can, but it doesn't make sense, okay? And this goes to partly answering your question because, and Bjorn, you mentioned the 70s before you were born. You know, I'm from the era, okay? You know, and around that time, the government made a very conscious decision, okay, to basically de-emphasize agriculture, because agriculture, as we all know, doesn't create much value, unfortunately, which is why food is underpriced. You know, in fact, except for the last 10 years or so, prices of food are going down. You know, since the 07-08 crisis, they've been rising slowly, okay? But not all farmers are getting the value of this, you know, food increase. So the government actually, you know, decided to implement basically this policy where It will encourage economic growth by investing in the finance sector, engineering, the computers, stuff like that. Okay, because those create much more value to help us increase the income of the average Singapore household. Yeah, and I think the rationale is that by having each household have a higher GDP per capita, and it's one of the highest in the world now, we can afford to buy food. Yeah, but this is all fine and dandy, as Faria knows very well, if there are no disruptions. Yeah, but once there are disruptions, climate change, pandemic, we're in big trouble. In fact, I mean, one of the indexes we all quote is the Global Food Security Index. And I actually developed an alternate index, okay, called the Rice Bowl Index, which is based on robustness. When we did our analysis, in fact, we were ashamed to even have Singapore on the list because our robustness, our ability to kind of resist perturbations was so low, below all our neighboring countries. Okay? So yeah, certainly I think going forward, I think we need multiple approaches. Import is just one of them. But to secure those imports means that we got to build relationships with other countries, which we're trying to do now in the ASEAN region. I think it's part of the government's policy to increase our relationships, what we call our relationship capital with neighboring countries. The other is through legal means, legal agreements that bind exporting countries not to stop the exports because of certain legal agreements that they might be taken to WTO and so on. So there are some regulations that we can actually look to help us at least conserve part of this supply line that comes in. Because without that, we're really quite sunk, okay? Even going forward. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I learned something new today, a term called relationship capital. Definitely agree on that. Stuart Oder, founder of Alaska Life, mentioned in the first panel that if we use vertical farms to grow things like rice, corn, or maize, it would be a tremendous commercial failure simply because it's grown so efficiently elsewhere. So we definitely, and I'm quite confident that we will hit that 30% target, that we cannot neglect that remaining 70% for food security. Farida, I just want to hear your thoughts as well in terms of diversification. And Evelyn, I'll get to you right after that.
Oh, thanks, Ben. So I guess I wanted to again echo that very important point, right? That actually self-sufficiency did not always mean security, because from a modeling point of view, that also means concentration risk, even if that concentration risk means Singapore, right? Something could happen. Yeah, climate change could affect our conditions and our environment. Inputs can't get in, etc. So it isn't about. I hope Singaporeans, especially the youth, understand this. It isn't about rolling back policies and going back to the good old days, of reaching 70%, 80%. It's really not. And I think we've come this far to articulate that food security is really, the government has a three-pronged strategy, right? So one is import diversification, second is local production, and the third is stockpiling, which is a very blunt tool. It is literally buy and then keep, So the food security is actually, how do you find that optimal mix across these three different strategies? And they each have a trade-off, and they each actually have a very real cost, right? Just on import diversification, I think we neither do we want to put it out there that actually we should be very proud. We're a trading nation. We have all of these relationships, and we're actually one of the most diversified countries in the world in terms of our food supply chain. So I give you an example, right? So eggs, in the last, especially during the pandemic, we spoke a lot about eggs and the various import diversification sort of policies that we've put in place, right? Today, we've grown the number of countries and the farms from which we import our eggs by almost 50%, from just about 47 or so, just under 50 in 7 countries. That was in 2016, to almost 72 farms in 11 countries in 2019. Right, and this is the same for all of the other produce that we're looking at, products and produce that we're looking at. So this is a real whole of government effort that we've been putting in place, of course, led by actually it's co-led, I would say, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, our Trade and Industry, Singapore Food Agency, because at the end of the day, of course, we want to make sure that the imports that we're bringing in are actually up to our food and safety standards, because the last time you want to do is actually compromise that. right? So we have to also, of course, ensure that the food that we're bringing in, yes, is diversified, but it's also safe for Singaporeans to eat. And then, of course, you have those relationships that you're cultivating, like Prof. Paul mentioned, tapping on our relationship capital and growing that, and then local production. The government itself, both SFA, Enterprise Singapore, and even our research institutes actually have been dedicating quite a lot of their own internal resources to try and pivot in technologies from other sectors to help create new agri-tech solutions that are far more that actually enable things to be, our produce to be, for example, more nutritious, to enable systems that are more energy efficient, more water efficient, etc. So actually all the different government agencies are just trying to play their part and actually enable all of us to reach that food security goals that we're looking at for 2030.
Thanks for sharing, Farida. I think it's so crucial to bring to light the tremendous amount of effort that is an entire army of people from the government to ensure that we have the food in our fair prices, our sheng siongs, and that maybe Singaporeans should not take that for granted, and hopefully that will address some of the food wastage issues that Beyond has brought up. But Evelyn, I know that you had a point to share just now, if you'd like to chime in now.
Okay. Yeah, I want to add on to what Prof. Paul had been talking about, growing plants in the pot. Yes, yeah. A food forest has got so much biodiversity, and in my farm I've got about 100 over plants, and I can still add on some more plants to increase the diversity. And so it has a place in Singapore's agricultural system, because it can be a bank, a repository for all the different heritage plants that we have, all the perennials that we have. And so, in Singapore, I think NParsport is trying to create also and make people do more and sort of introduce people to more farming. They can create also little food forests. It didn't have to be 7 layer. It can be 3 layer, it can be 4 layer, on a small little space that they can find. So it needs also a bank for all this perennial.
Thanks, Evelyn. Maybe now I want to, we won't go back to, we don't have the land, maybe we don't have the labor to go back to what was 1975 to the early 80s. And technology has to play a role in ensuring that we do meet that 30% local nutritional needs. Maybe I'd like to ask Beyond now. I'm hearing now that there's a spectrum, not necessarily camps, but from soil-based farming all the way to high-tech controlled environment agriculture. Beyond, you don't just have to answer this question, but you can add on more than that as well. How can soil-based farming and high-tech farming coexist in Singapore's foodscape?
Before I jump to that question, I also agree that we shouldn't romanticize the kampong, right? It was there, kampong was good. We have to find a evolution of that approach. Well, my training is in soil-based farming and growing, and of course, agri-tech, which can be applied to soil farming and broad acre farming, all the way to indoor vertical LED lights. Tech applies to all sectors within the space. I see there can be synergies around how tech can help. For example, I think Paul did mention when we chatted yesterday about sensors and probes can help farmers make better decisions, or to encounter or counter problems within their farms before it even happens. For example, how even biodynamic farmers all around the world are adopting technology, for example, spraying their preparations using drones instead of using tractors, so that they don't compact the soil, so that the vines can grow better. So I think tech has definitely ability to improve the agriculture industries applied correctly and mindfully and thoughtfully as well. I think what we have done is that we have put high-tech farms and indoor farms, vertical farms next to soil-based farms, right? At our farm at Jalan Penjara, that is a showcase in that aspect. I feel the sort of opportunity that we have is that um, we are a garden city or city in nature today. And today we have 133 hectares of skyrise greenery area, right, in Singapore. A lot of them planted with ornamental plants. This 133 hectares have the infrastructure already there, right? Whether they have the soil, the irrigation, the planters, and this is a very simple solution to then plant things that are the soil is there, plant things that are native, that doesn't need a lot of care, that can be a resilient food bank for the nation. In a way, if we are able to govern and or able to encourage developers and the industry to really look at their landscape within their development as a nutrition bank, right? And measure them with a landscape nutrition index. How many sweet potatoes are they growing? How much carbohydrates are they actually banking in their landscape? Maybe we have a good step at the 30 by 30, because that is an easy thing to pivot to, and I hope that can happen soon. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you, Bjorn. In terms of you mentioning, in terms of the space, right, per hectare, per meter square, how much is produced in terms of productivity, and it's really interesting to hear that this 133 hectares can already has the infrastructure to do so. I want to ask Farida now, because I do understand there is financial support provided to different enterprises, some on the farm vertical, as you're mentioning. Might I ask what sorts of criteria are these farms measured on? Is it in terms of yield, how much they're producing, how much they're selling? And a separate question to that later on is there any interest or is it under Enterprises Singapore purview to rate their sustainability overall as well? Yeah.
Thanks, Ben. I think first and foremost, it's important to note that as a government, right, we are not prescriptive in the technologies and the approach, and that is what we leave the individual enterprises and farms to decide on, be it soil-based, high-tech, or even a combination of both. Aquaponics is we're starting to see sort of a resurgence of those different types of models. Our job is really to enable, first and foremost, a conducive environment for all of these types of agri-tech enterprises to have access to what they need to kickstart the business, be it infrastructure or debt financing, and then later on, as they develop, how do we have, after setting up, how do we help them scale, right? Because at least for Enterprise Singapore, our ambition is not just about food security in Singapore, but as Paul mentioned, it's really actually, if we've got a good thing going on here in Singapore, and if we can solve our own needs, there's 9 billion people in the world that we have to feed, and so that is that bigger market and that bigger cause that we all have to, that we fundamentally believe Singapore can play a role in. So in terms of support for enterprises, again, it's not prescriptive. Enterprises, of course, for us and most of the government grants, we are looking for things like local shareholding, because ultimately it is about supporting our local enterprises. The two key agencies that are in this space of providing both financial and non-financial support would be Enterprise Singapore as well as the Singapore Food Agency. Sometimes people get us mixed up. That's okay. There's no wrong door policy. So for the Singapore Food Agency, you may recall with the recent budget announcement back in April, they launched a new fund, the ACT Fund, the Agri-Food Cluster Transformation Fund, and that really looks at supporting farms in their setup costs, infrastructure included as well. In addition to that, there's also funding that's available for things like R&D and pilot testing, etc. For Enterprise Singapore, where we try to come in and value add is to say that once you've got that farm running, right, or that enterprise running, how do we help you access more customers? How do we help you build other core capabilities? For example, these days, our farms are looking to sell direct to customers, to consumers. So what do you need? You need digital marketing support. You need, perhaps even some of the support that we give in terms of e-commerce booster packages and the like. In addition to that, for some of our farms, they're very ready to say, I'm gonna go overseas. We've got 36 overseas centers. Pick a country. Most likely we cover it. I can't help you if it's a North or South Pole, but somewhere in between we can most certainly try and help and find you connections to those markets as well. And then there's also one I think very understated support that we have, and this goes back to again Prof Paul's point about relationship capital, is that we don't actually have to innovate by ourselves. We've got very good partnerships with actually the EU, right? We're part of the Eureka network, which is a fantastic innovation network in which local Singapore enterprises can collaborate with those in the EU, in the UK, Netherlands, for example. We've also got the SIRD grant, which is a Singapore-Israel cooperation that is looking at supporting agri-food collaborations between Singapore and Israel. So again, there is funding support for eligible enterprises. So I would definitely encourage our agri-tech enterprises, be it, and again, doesn't just have to be farms, right? We're talking about the food value chain here. If you are sitting on a novel IP in terms of, how to make eat more sustainable, we want to talk to you. If you're looking at the next up and coming systems to enable more efficient energy consumption and water consumption, we want to talk to you. Or maybe you have a way of solving, some of our value chain issues, maybe traceability and otherwise. You are part of that value chain, and we, of course, together with SFA, want to support you on that.
Thank you for sharing, Farida. And Ing Xuan, also from Enterprise Singapore, has shared some of the links about the ongoing initiatives to these issues. Paul, maybe now I'd like to get your opinion on how soil-based farming and high-tech farming can coexist in Singapore's foodscape. And this echoes one of the questions that came from our listeners today, where this person asks, I'm interested in the idea of food forest, but would a tech food forest be possible rather than a traditional one, or would it be defeating the purpose?
Well, okay, first of all, I think there's room within our Singapore landscape for coexistence of many different forms of farming. Because ultimately, it is farming. Okay? But to ensure sustainability of farming, I think somebody else mentioned that there's some three basic criteria that has to be met. Today we believe in, right? It's got to be ecological and environmentally sound. It's got to be ecologically viable, and it's got to be socially equitable. I was one of the early workers on sustainable agriculture. And these were the three criteria we thought were most important, actually. If you start applying the criteria to the Singapore landscape, then there's a lot of untapped potential for farms, or for, let's say, call them gardens, because farms are, sometimes by definition out there to make money as well. Okay, let's say gardens, which really are ecologically very sustainable. Whether they're forests or not, I think it's up to whatever anybody wants to do, really. In fact, there was a NUS student who once worked out for me how much potential unused space there is in Singapore, okay, which can be used basically for gardens. Okay, now, however, we just can't survive on vegetables alone. Okay, you still got to have the other food items, the fish, the meat, chicken, the eggs, and so on. Yeah. So yes, we can certainly address part of our food security by having a mixture of different kinds of farms. And I think definitely there's room for coexistence here in Singapore. And we're starting to see that emerge. Now, the beauty of our democratic system in Singapore, is that sometimes some enterprises get supported more, some succeed, others don't. Okay? Whereas, I think something we haven't learned, and because I'm old enough, I can say that we haven't learned from sort of Western democracies is that there's also such thing as guided democracy. If you look, at the extent to which the EU and the US subsidizes their farmers, it's just incredible. Okay? You might want to ask, if we really believe that Singapore has, a capacity to ensure, let's say, a certain level of self-sufficiency, not 100%, okay? Let's say 30%, even 50%, right? Then we need to have government involvement to so-called securitize the whole food production process. Call it what you might, it may not be a direct subsidy, but in some way having policies, enablers that really entice people to invest in farming, invest in gardens, invest their energy, their time, and so on. Yeah, and personally, I think that can be done by having a real mixture. Now, having said that, some people also forget that some of the soil-based conventional farming goes beyond just growing food. I think they're an important part of the Singapore landscape. Like Evelyn's food forest, for example, it's such an important landscape because it provides ecological services. It's in situ conservation of important indigenous vegetables and so on, really. They're also getting Singaporeans who live in cities to learn about farming. So there's a lot of intangible benefits. But then you also have to weigh it against the controlled environment agriculture, indoor farms. Because as we go forward, we expect climate change to get worse. Okay? So the controlled environment agriculture, in fact, is one buffer against climate change, even though it's economically still not viable yet, fortunately. Okay? So thanks. No, that's all I have to share. Yeah.
That's huge. Thanks, Paul. At this point, thank you for your questions in the Slido app. Some of them have already been answered, but I think one question that has really resonated with me is from 30 by 30, think forward to 2050, maybe even beyond that. What percentage might we produce locally then? Or maybe more importantly, what's your vision for the longer term of what Singapore can be for world food? And I'd like to hear first Evelyn's response to this question.
Oh, okay. Can you repeat the question again? Sorry.
What's your vision for Singapore's foodscape beyond 2030, maybe 2040, 2050?
Oh, yeah. That there will be some food forests in Singapore, and that there will be miniature food forests all over Singapore.
Thank you. Thanks, Evelyn. Farida?
I have quite a, I don't know what's the word to use, but maybe I'll just describe what I hope we can achieve, which is something that we are already putting in place. Is I think going back our earlier conversations on, are we resilient in all of the different parts of the value chain, and Prof. Paul highlighted inputs, for example, right? And I think, and he was alluding to this work that we're doing in the area of seeds, for example. By 2050, if we do what we need to do now, right? What we want to be able to say is that we may not be producing all the seeds here in Singapore, but we want to be known for being able to, or for having developed what we term as super seeds, right? Genetically superior seeds that produce highly nutritious, maybe even Asian greens, right? Because a lot of the current technology is looking, a lot of research is very focused on Angmo vegetables lah, right? But most of Southeast Asia and Asia in general, we are creatures of habit, right? We are looking still to our Asian green. So that's, I think, one of the key, I think, what we call moonshot goals that we're looking at. It's going to take a very long time because it is an R&D play. It is an IP play as well. And you need to obviously have talent in line. You need to have resources and the like. But I think it's a worthy ambition. I think definitely the research community supports us in that. And what we're trying to get at is, I guess, at some point, even if we're not producing those things in Singapore, right? If you hold the key, that critical key, that one part of that critical value chain, is that more meaningful in terms of, say, crisis, right? For you to activate those levers, for you to get actual access to what it is that you need. So that's sort of our thinking. So let's see, let's check back in 2050.
Thank you. Thanks, Farida. Paul, any of your thoughts on what the vision of Singapore's foodscape what you would like it to be?
Well, first of all I know is that whatever I say, I won't be around to get it verified, right? 2050. Okay? But I certainly think, that as Singapore's population grows, we must be very realistic in our expectations, of how much food we can produce ourselves. Okay? Now, that realism, I think, to me, is premised on having a mixture of high-tech and so-called conventional, kind of low-tech, and some of which are high-tech farms as well. Okay? But that, I think, has to be supplemented by more use of the unused space at the moment. Okay? And also, I guess you could say legitimate space like community gardens. Personally, I think we can have a lot more community gardens in Singapore. And we can let them play a bigger role, not just through bartering, but changing policy and guidelines, which actually allow them to sell their produce at farmers markets. As we all know, right now, you can't sell your produce unless you've got a license from SFA, which is so different from other countries. Now, I go to farmers markets a lot every time I travel. I just love them, not just because of the heirloom products, but because of the people there who have a much better sense, of what I call sustainable agriculture. Making sure that you leave the land and the production system in an even better situation for future generations than what it is today. And that's true sustainable agriculture. Right? We talk about sustainability nowadays, but we're so influenced, by our immediate issues. We really don't think long term. Okay? My only fear is that by 2050, the global food situation might change so much that even our 70% will be competing with the big boys like China, India to buy food. And that's my greatest fear. Even though we have money, there may not be enough food for us to buy. Okay? So that's kind of my both optimistic and pessimistic view of the future. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Paul. And now I'd like to give the floor to Beyond. Maybe share. I really am keen to hear your ideal on the Singapore's future foodscape, but also maybe what it would take to get there. Maybe some of the challenges you're facing, maybe some kind of assistance you want from the community, government to move this forward.
I want to echo what everyone said. I wish that there will be more seed banks, whether community-led or industry-led, working on more natural open pollinated varieties, so that we can build local resiliency in our seed supply, instead of relying on hybridized seeds or genetically modified ones from overseas. I also want to sort of support the 1,300 community gardens we have in Singapore today, for them to be able to sell produce. Really, for the community to start innovating, and also innovating growing techniques. You see wonderful produce coming out from community gardens and farms. Some of the experts there I've learned a lot from. I think that kind of knowledge is very invaluable, and we need to encapsulate that knowledge and share that with everyone. One of the big things I really hope to see is, hopefully sooner than later, is that we have somewhat of a native food industry starting in Singapore, not led by corporations or other sort of commercial interests, but really led by the indigenous people of the land, and really for them to bring that knowledge back, so that we can redesign perhaps what we eat, change the mindsets of Singaporeans to eat more locally, to eat what is around us, than to eat with a global palate. I hope, together as a society, we could reach a food collective actualization to really kind of embody what food and food sustainability truly means to all of us. And really seeing that regenerative landscape in Singapore with food forests, Evelyn, with many food forests all around on the rooftops, 133 hectares, to really create a sustainable city for the future. So it can be a model for other cities in the region and around the world. I don't have much ask from the government, so I'll leave that request empty at this point. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing this, Beyond. And it echoes a little bit what Stuart was mentioning in the first panel, where we said that you can't stop a lot of the demographic changes that are happening, especially in terms of you can't stop more people from entering more urban spaces. And it would be lovely if Singapore can be a model for that decades down the road. The time has passed very quickly. I would like to thank my esteemed panelists for all of the inputs. Truly appreciate being part of this effort. Also a very proud Yale-NUS alumnus today with the efforts from the Roosevelt Institute and Yale-NUS, and also the newly formed Yale-NUS Farming Committee. I would like to hand the floor back to Nithiya, as I understand there are some shout outs that need to go on.
Okay, thank you everyone. I hope we all left on a very hopeful note. When we started this, one of the questions we really asked is kale or sweet potato leaves, right? And, you know, culture drives economy. And we really thought, okay, you know, we wanted to get all these guys working on a corporate, commercial policy making sphere in. But the takeaway has really been that we have to become individual stakeholders in Singapore's future food landscape. And for me personally, like we're thinking of how do we move on from here, right? And I think while we're all working from home, I would encourage everyone to go to the wet markets while you can. Pick up some ingredients, you know, be it turmeric, be it whatever herbs you see there, because, you know, those are resilient plants to grow at home, right? They're going to thrive no matter what. It's going to be impossible to kill. Start growing your own lemongrass, start growing your own local herbs. We also want you to get your hands dirty, start cooking more, right? For yourself, for your community, whether it's bad or whether it's good, just start. And start writing about it, start blogging about it, start sharing videos about it. Now, if you type in kale into Google for recipe suggestions, you have thousands of hits. But if I type in moringa or if I type in sweet potato, there is like, okay, you know, you make sambal sweet potato leaves, or you make moringa with grated coconut and spring onions. But you can make a quiche, you can make laksa leaf pesto. There's so many things that we can do. So start experimenting, start sharing, and let's create a knowledge capital for all of us to access. Volunteer at your local farms or barter your time for produce, right into Evelyn, right into Edible Garden City, right into anyone. Start community gardens. So start getting engaged, start growing, start cooking, start eating. And that's how we think this movement is going to start, where there is going to be a balance between tech and native edible plants. Indigenous communities are going to be part of the discussion. There's going to be more diversity in the future food landscape. And whether you're eating for pleasure, for nutrition, or for community, hopefully for all three, you're also part of the cooking and growing process. So there's a lot of projects. Yale-NUS Farm is also going to share about what they're doing. As for me, you can also write to me. We are starting this thing called the Ulam Project, which is a native edible plant platform. It's going to be a lifestyle platform with recipe ideas on other ways that you can use these plants, how to grow them. We are also working with MSC to start up a seed banking initiative. It's a community open source seed banking initiative where we hope to bring in lots of community gardens and other farmers on board to share their seeds, especially third generation, and as Bjorn mentioned, open pollinated seeds as well. So I'm just going to pass it over to Yale-NUS to share a little bit about their projects.
Hi everyone. So we just wanted to share with everyone about what has been happening in Yale-NUS so far. We've been very inspired by the local movements that have been mushrooming. Actually, it started off as a small hobbyist passion project, but then the more research that we started doing into the rest of Singapore, we realized that how many communities out there in various parts of heartlands and even far-flung areas in the hidden away farms, so much has been happening, so much has been growing. So we've been really inspired by that. And I feel like our organization is really testament to how much you can learn from just looking beyond your small bubble. So within our bubble, we have our sweet, tiny but sweet and healthy sort of organic farm that we run purely by students. We've also had the privilege of involving some external instructors from external organizations like Marcus from One Man Farmer and even Chingwei from Grana Initiative. So what we really want to do is to impart a space in our school community that can allow a personal connection for many people, young people like us who really haven't had this sort of experience of farming at all. So with that small space and that personal touch, we want to sort of encourage more people to get involved, get interested in sustainability efforts. So that's the sort of angle that we're going into in our own school. And yeah, and So we really believe that the more we look out and learn from others around us, we will be able to know more about Singapore and know more about how we can. So that's how this panel got involved. Got created, and also with Nithiya. So yeah, we really thank everybody for listening, joining us, and we really thank the speakers for gracing our panel, sharing their experiences, being so generous and so willing to even come down on a Saturday. And thank you everyone for listening in. And so now we'll just put up some shout outs to thank our speakers, and for anyone who would like to know more about them, you can find them through these links. Yeah. Thank you everyone.
Okay, I think we are good to go. Ben, do you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, sorry, could we go 2 slides in front? I think that might be a little quick, yeah. So if anyone wants to screenshot these things. All right.
Paul, are you on Instagram?
No, I'm not.
What's the best way to reach out to you?
You know, I'm a traditionalist. I still love my email. Okay? I mean, I'm on FaceTime, on LinkedIn.
Yeah. Perfect. Maybe we can go to the one, be part of something, that slide. No, in front. Yes, be part of the conversation. It's come up many times from first panel to the last. There's a lot of unused land, a lot of untapped land, but also that Singapore doesn't have enough land, right? I think the URA right now is conducting a public engagement exercise. There isn't a lot about food or food producing land or farms, but definitely do provide your input on where it's going to go. I don't mean to target any particular community by this, but to put things into perspective, right? We have 200 hectares of land in Singapore for farming, but in comparison, we have about 1,500 hectares of land for golf. So maybe if you personally would like to see a change, right? And I'm saying this from a personal capacity, maybe you can give your input as well. The SFA has also launched our Food Future consultation. So if you, I'm not too certain about the exact link for this, but if you're able to find it, do give your inputs as well as to perhaps how you would like the new high-tech agri-food park to look, what they should include. Do include your ideas as well, because this is a very consultative approach in our democracy, and we'd love to hear your opinions. That is all. And I'll leave my email in the... If anyone wants to reach out to me about aquaculture, of course, I'm flying Hatch's flag today. We are one of the Startup SG Accelerator grant recipients from Enterprise Singapore. I think I do everything about aquaculture and alternative seafood. Meet everyone in Singapore. Would love to hear your thoughts as well if you're interested in this space. Thank you. Thank you everyone for your time today.